To Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Yosemite National Park Unveiled, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader Colby Brokvist and WWF's Vice President for Conservation Travel, Jim Sano. It's a pleasure to have you both with us today. Colby, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Well, thanks, Kendall. Thank you for having us here today. And thank you to everybody for joining our presentation all about Yosemite. This is a very special place for Jim and I, and we've actually had a Nat Hab trip in the past to Yosemite before. It was a wonderful trip. We're out of rotation, and now we have a brand new one back, and it's been a lot of fun to design it. I know you're interested in hearing about the itinerary. We're going to talk all about places like this one here, Half Dome. We're going to get you to some of the waterfalls. We'll talk about how we're going to do it a little differently, getting you up close and personal, and of course, really getting out there. One of the big things about this trip, our big focuses, was trying to find ways to make Yosemite more intimate, how we can show off the park, but do it in special ways that are a little bit different. So we'll be out there hiking with you. But we thought we'd tell you a little bit about Yosemite in terms of a story. Jim and I both have some strong connections to the park. Jim, you used to be a ranger. Can you tell us what inspired you to first go to Yosemite? What do you like about this park? How did you come to be there?
Well, I had the great fortune of having parents who loved to camp, and they were really outliers there in the Japanese American community, and we went camping every summer, including Yosemite. And my first backpack trip with my dad was up in Tuolumne Meadows, which is in the high country, and that really inspired my sister and I to, at least first part, work for the park concessionaire at the Tuolumne Meadows Lodge, and then ultimately I was a summer seasonal ranger for 7 summers, and then another 7 summers I worked as a permanent ranger in the park, overseeing the naturalist programs in the northern half of the park, and also working on the master plan. So what about you, Colby? What's your connection?
Well, my connection was also hiking in the outdoors. This is me up on top of one of the mountaineering summits in the northern part of the park. And I originally came to Yosemite on the Pacific Crest Trail. I hiked from Mexico up to the northern border of Canada, and the trail goes right through the High Sierra and Yosemite. And when we got to the Tuolumne Meadows area, that you're so beholden with, we just stopped short. We were slack-jawed and just cruised around Tuolumne, and then ended up hitchhiking down into the valley, and we spent 2 weeks there. Just took a 2-week hiatus because we were so mesmerized with this park. And I decided that I wanted to be in Yosemite, and my first guiding jobs ever were in Yosemite National Park, and I worked there for 14 years in Yosemite in the High Sierra. So every day I would be there, whether or not I was working or playing, I'd be inside that park.
Oh wow, 14 years as well. So share that in common.
And similarly slack-jawed in our pictures, I noticed as well. I expect that's what people will feel when they got here. So Jim, we plan to tell a little bit of the story about Yosemite and its place in the American park system, but also as it has to do with conservation and adventure travel. Would you like to start us off with the story of Yosemite?
Oh, sure. Well, Yosemite's history actually starts anywhere between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, when the Native American groups that lived in this area, they're both the Miwoks, northern and southern Miwok Native Americans on the west side of the mountains, and the Monopayu Native Americans on the east side. And here in the Yosemite Valley, this is the Iwani, the historic Iwani, which the Native Americans called Place of the Gaping Mount, or Deep Grassy Valley. And so the group of Miwoks that lived here were the Awanichis. Next slide. So this area really entranced a lot of individuals. It was California up until about the 1948 at the time of the Mexican-American War, was overseen by the Mexicans. And then the war happened, And then right after that is when gold was discovered in California in 1949, which really kind of precipitated the miners were in the foothills, and they started moving up into this area, and really that was a source of conflict that ultimately drove out the Native Americans over into the east side. Next slide. So when people were really entranced by this area, the previous slide, before this area was set aside, was really, it was mesmerizing for a lot of individuals painters and photographers like Biersat in the previous photo. And when around this time, again, there was incursion and the displacement of the Native Americans. And in fact, the miners and the people who were really going into the park, they termed this area Uzumati, which is kind of a corruption for grizzly bears, or the grizzly bear people, which ultimately migrated into the word as we now know it, Yosemite. Next slide. So Colby wants to take over here.
Yeah, I can take over. Thanks. So what was happening at the time was we had this explosion of recreation, of tourism in the park. We had people that lived in the park that were sending out flyers. They were hiring artists to come in, and they were making brochures, sending them out east and trying to bring people to Yosemite to experience everything that was there. But it wasn't protected. So people were claiming private properties. We're into the times now of the Homestead Act. There were people like Ledig who had actually had an orchard that you can still see today. It's the Curry Village parking lot with all of its apple trees. People were settling inside the park. And so some people took note. They said, wow, we have this really special place. It can be really meaningful for people, and it's very different than other places. As we know today, Yosemite is one of the crown jewels of not just the American park system, but of the parks worldwide. And so there was a push to try to protect Yosemite. Interestingly, this whole idea culminated in the middle of the Civil War. Civil War went until 1865, if I recall. And in 1864, Abraham Lincoln was able to designate Yosemite as a park. Now, they did that not as a national park, which is an interesting part of the story, but they did it as essentially a state park. They granted Yosemite to the state of California. And what that protected was it protected Yosemite Valley itself, but only within the confines of the valley, nothing up above the valley, none of the headwaters to the rivers, nothing like that. It also included the giant sequoias within the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. Yosemite has several sequoia groves. The Mariposa Grove is the most famous with the largest trees, and that was the one. These two areas were completely separate at the time, and you had to drive from one part of the park to another while going through what were just federal lands.
Right, and it was really the first time in all of human history that a tract of wild land was set aside and for public use, recreation, and also resort, inalienable for all time. And so it was really a landmark act. Also, another interesting fact about this is that, again, it was during the Civil War when approximately 2,000 soldiers were being killed every day. It also, at that time, became, when California was created a state around this time, prior to that, became a union state. And so there's a very interesting story, backdrop story in terms of how the park was created. We'd be happy to share that story with you if have a really wonderful article on that. So, go ahead, Colby.
Yeah, and so here we have Frederick Law Olmsted, who I think many of our viewers will recognize as the designer of Central Park in New York City, along with a lot of other famous places. Earlier on in his career, he was actually managing John C. Fremont's gold mine and estate in Mariposa, which is just outside of the mouth of Yosemite. The Merced River that goes through Yosemite Valley goes right through this little town of Mariposa. And so at this time, early 1860s, I guess, Olmsted was there, and he would have been familiar with the valley at that point. People were going up into the valley. You saw a picture of an old hotel a couple images ago. And Olmsted and some of his cohorts started saying, hey, we need to do something about this. We can't let this whole place be privatized. And so he used his connections out east, as well as his connections with Fremont, who was about to become a California state senator, to get Yosemite legislation passed.
Right, and it's interesting again that Olmsted and this fellow Galen Clark were on the first commission to manage and set the policy for the park. In fact, I found a really interesting quote at the time when the commission was set up. Olmsted said, "Before many years, these hundreds of visitors will become thousands. And in a century, the whole number of visitors will be counted in millions." And this was really kind of the precept of ultimately the National Park Service mission.
A lot of foresight at that time,
right.
huh? To imagine that that's what was about to happen.
Right.
A lot of people realized that was going to happen and realized that Yosemite was a special place. And so here we have a picture of John Muir, who I think a lot of us are familiar with as one of the fathers of American conservation. Muir, like Jim and I, he showed up to Yosemite and fell in love and just stayed there. There's a wonderful story of him walking from San Francisco across the Central Valley, coming up into Yosemite Valley, and he wrote quite a bit about the park. I'd like to share with you a quote from him quickly. John Muir said, "Yosemite is by far the grandest of all of the special temples of nature." And this was a man that spent his entire life in the outdoors and teaching natural history and practicing conservation. He had that to say about the park. So now we really enter into the time of wilderness stewardship, preservation, conservation. All of these ideas are stemming from the Romantic era. Emerson was highly influential on John Muir. John Muir was influential on a lot of other people, and ultimately that his writings and his clout and his ability to bring people together for the interests of conservation in the park led to a big restructuring of Yosemite. And so there's a famous, I'm getting ahead of ourselves, Jim. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to throw it to you to the map.
Well, of course, the first national park was Yellowstone in 1872. But again, I go back to 1864, which was really kind of the landmark piece of legislation that ultimately planted the seed for Yellowstone. And as Colby was saying, more and more people were falling in love, poets, artists, photographers. And then ultimately, this map here dates to 1891, when the boundaries of Yosemite were greatly expanded. Yosemite Valley and actually Mariposa Grove, the Big Tree, stayed within the state, which were ultimately later added. But this became kind of a national shrine. And so if we can go to the next slide. Now, this is all before the National Park Service was created. So the 4th Army Cavalry out of the Presidio in San Francisco, which is now part of the National Park Service as well, when that base was decommissioned, they sent off soldiers to go patrol the park to keep the sheep herders out, the illegal timber harvesting and so forth. And one of the regiments that they sent out there were the African-American group called the Buffalo Soldiers, which you may have heard of before, and that's another really fascinating chapter of Yosemite history. And they would ride 200 miles to roughly where Fresno is today, and they would patrol both Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks. So next slide. why don't you talk about the Sierra Club?
Yeah, and we're thinking a little bit more again about Muir's influence, and then just the ability now to get up into the national parks in the surrounding national forest. So John Muir, he was one of the founders of the Sierra Club in the early 1890s, became its first president for a long time. And one of the big things that the Sierra Club was doing at the time was they would have these outings, and they would go in larger groups. Often they were stock supported. They go up into the mountains and they would go and explore. And at this point, there were enough trails and enough basic maps that people could figure out where they were going, and they knew sort of what to expect in each drainage. But they didn't know everything that was going to be there. And so they would go up with surveyors and maps, and they would explore. They would climb peaks for the first time. They would follow little creek drainages. And essentially what the Sierra Club outings ended up being was the start of adventure tourism in California. And I think that's really cool. So we have, as travelers on the Nat Hab trips going to Yosemite, we have a direct connection to John Muir, to the Sierra Club, what Judge William Colby was doing at the time, bringing people up and having a good time up into the wilderness. The Sierra Club was much different at that time than it is today. Ultimately, they would start taking on challenges like not damming the river by blowing up what's today a national monument in Devil's Postpile. They fought against Hetch Hetchy. The things that were happening in and around Yosemite ended up being the start of the conservation initiatives that we now recognize the Sierra Club being so powerful and important for. Start of adventure travel.
Right. So yeah, as Colby mentioned, those trips really, the board of directors of the Sierra Club actually wanted these trips to take people up in the mountains to understand the value of conserving and protecting these national treasures. And one of his trips out west, President Theodore Roosevelt went out to Yosemite and visited the park. John was his guide, and they were originally not scheduled to. They had a fixed itinerary for the president, but John Muir talked Teddy Roosevelt into going up here to Glacier Point and kind of going rogue and camping out overnight with John Muir, and really kind of inspired him in after 1903 to get more deeply involved in conservation and expanding national parks and protected areas, and ultimately inspiring others like Gifford Pinchot to start the Forest Service and create more protected areas where there was mixed use. So next slide.
That led to another larger restructuring of the park there in 1906. And at that point, Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove were brought into the park and put under the direction of the U.S. Cavalry. And that went on until about 1916. And in 1916, something else was coming to a head. And this man pictured here, Stephen Mather, is the person that was in charge of sort of consolidating what would become the National Park Service. So at that point, we had some parks that were strewn about the American West. They were all being managed at the time by the military. Some of them even looked very much like that. If you're ever at Yellowstone's headquarters in Mammoth, you'll see that the whole place is laid out like a military base, including a parade ground right in the middle of it all. But the parks all had sort of different visions for how they would be managed. There were different considerations going on locally with management and with conservation, and they needed some structure to them, and they needed some consistency. And so Mather took it upon himself to do that. And he worked with another man, Horace Albright, and together they crafted what is today's National Park Service.
Right, Mather is really interesting because he was a wealthy industrialist of 20, you might remember, 20 Mule Team Borax fame, and he wrote to the Secretary of the Interior, kind kind of saying, you know, these parks are not well managed and there really should be some entity to manage these parks. And the Secretary of Interior said, well, why don't you be the first director? And that's how it came into being. And ultimately his real assistant, who was is Horace Albright, who ultimately became the director of the Park Service after Mather retired.
Jim, thanks for covering that for a second. I bailed because I have something special to show everybody. Another part of the story is that so there was a lot of talk about the national parks. They needed to be funded. They needed a national park service. Not everybody wanted to do that. And there were still a lot of people in Congress that felt like setting aside land for people to just look at was maybe not the best use of that. They were thinking about timber resources, about sheep herding, about mining resources. And they said, well, maybe it's not useful now, but it could be useful later. And so there was a need to convince people that were in power out east that what we had out here in the west was special and worth preserving. And so what Mather actually did in order to accomplish sort of building momentum was he organized the Mather Mountain Party. And they went into the High Sierra. He brought with him a bunch of photographers and journalists. And notably, one of the people that helped organize this whole party was Gilbert Grosvenor, who you may recognize from National Geographic magazine. At that point, National Geographic was just over about 20 years old, but it already had a substantial reputation. And what they did is they went out around the West. They started in the Sierra. They went to what's today Kings Canyon National Park, that was known as General Grant back then. They went to Sequoia. They went to Yosemite. They also went to other places, including Crater Lake, all over the place. But what they did is they produced this National Geographic magazine, which took me a few years to obtain a copy of once I heard about it. And Grosvenor himself does an introduction to what's essentially the treasures of the American West. And they created a magazine. There's the geysers of Yellowstone that's in there. There's some Yosemite pictures. Some of the pictures of what's today Canyonlands National Park. That wasn't even a park back then. They took pictures of that stuff. And they made a copy of this magazine and they put it on the desk of every senator and every congressman. There's a nice picture of Half Dome with all the flowers, just like you'll see it in there. But they sent this to every single congressman at the time, and they used that to try to convince them that these places of scenic beauty were worth preserving in their own right.
And of course, around that time is when Ansel Adams first appeared on the scene as well, and was photographed. He ultimately had a studio in the valley and produced some of his best work. The other thing that happened around that time was the Park Service, and Stephen Mather and Horace Albright felt it was really important to attract influential individuals to the park to support the national parks. And so that was the genesis of some of the grand hotels. This is the Iwani Hotel in the valley to be constructed where you'll be staying. It's really a marvelous property, reflective of that era. I also had the privilege of being here when the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, and also Prince Philip stayed there in the early 1980s. And so that was quite a treat, being able to show them around the valley and some of the other Glacier Point. Next slide. Well, the other thing that happened around that time was the Yosemite Field School was created. And that was really kind of the first school for park naturalists. This is a fellow, Carl Scharschmidt. And one kind of interesting thing is his hat. You'll see it very closely matches the Army cavalry hats. So that was the genesis of park ranger hats. But anyway, next slide. Carl ended up spending 62 summers, and this is towards the end of his career as a seasonal naturalist. They had to privilege of nominally supervising him up at Tuolumne Meadows, but he's quite a botanist with San Jose State University. He discovered a number of different alpine flowers on this particular ridge, the Dana Plateau. So next slide. So Colby, why don't you take us through the itinerary?
Yeah, so here we have Yosemite today, and our itinerary is it's simplified, but we're going to see a lot of parts of the park. So if you were to look down on the southern part of the park, you'll notice the entrance there in Fish Camp. So that'll be the first place that we stay. Very quickly, I'll just take you through, and then we'll show you some more detailed slides. But we'll see the Mariposa Grove. We're going to move north out to Glacier Point. We're going to go into Yosemite Valley. We're going to spend several nights in Yosemite Valley, and that's one of the most special places on the itinerary. So we've designated extra time to be there. It's also really special to be able to stay there. So the famous Iwani Hotel that Jim told you about, that's where we're going to stay when we're in the park. And from the Iwani, we have the ability to just walk right out. No day users, you know, after about 5 or 6 o'clock, we have the whole place to ourselves right down there in a remote corner of the valley. From there, we're going to move up into the Tuolumne area. We'll get to see those big alpine meadows, and we're even going to have a special little dip over into the Eastern Sierra for a special little lake. So we'll show you a little bit about that as we go along. So some things to whet your appetite. Where are we here, Jim?
Mariposa Grove with the giant sequoias. So in California, you have this marvelous opportunity to see the tallest trees, which are along the coast, the trees that have the greatest mass, and these are the giant sequoias. And then over on the east side, we won't have a time to do that, but in the White Mountains, you have the Brisicombe pines, which are 5,000 years old. But we'll have time to spend, there are 3 groves of giant sequoias in the park, and this is one of the ones that was originally, again, set aside with the Yosemite grant in 1864. Next slide.
Once we get down into the Yosemite Valley, that's where we're going to start experiencing all the waterfalls. One thing that we have going on this trip is that there are 2 different guides because Yosemite, ultimately, you want to be out there and you want to be on foot. The days that we're in the valley, there'll be almost no driving. If we do drive around, it might just be to take advantage of the shuttle system that's in the park. So having 2 guides means that we have the ability to split the group up into different hiking ability groups. So if some people want more of a casual stroll, you want to go, you know, the bigger views of the waterfalls from a little bit of a distance, you want to cruise along the moderate trails that are along the river, you can do that. If people want something a little bit more challenging, you can do things like the famous Myth Trail here we see to Vernal Falls. So we do have the ability to not only see all of the things that you want to come see, but we can experience them. You can experience them in different ways with your guides when you're there.
Another iconic spot is El Capitan, which I don't know if anyone saw Free Solo, where the famous climber Alex Honnold scaled this mountain without a rope. It's about 3,000 feet tall, and it is an area that over history, especially when I first started in the park, it attracted such notables who were really kind of what we call dirtbag climbers, such as Yvon Chouinard and Royal Robbins and Warren Harding and so forth. And they really kind of pioneered. If you go down the middle, up the middle of the mountain there, that's a route called the Nose. And they really, they took some of the routes, it takes almost a month to get up. While you're climbing in various parts of it, all the way up to the top. And the top is around 7,200 feet or so. And the valley floor is about 4,000. Next slide.
Down on the valley floor is Camp 4. Actually, the climbing culture in Yosemite ends up being, it's right in your face, it's right in the forefront, and it's really fun. We can stand there with our binoculars in the valley and we can watch them. And even from the Iwani, at night we can walk out into the meadows and we can look up on the walls and you can see the headlamps, just little tiny dots up there on some of these big walls. In Yosemite, not only is it a great place to go climbing, but it's also quite famous for its climbing history. A lot of the gear, the safety, the cultural ethics around climbing and clean climbing originates here from Yosemite. And Camp 4 was where all these dirt bags, so-called dirt bags, would have been. And they were thinking years ago about raising all of Camp 4 and maybe making it into a more built-up campground with little RV sites like you see in other parts of the park. And everybody was sort of up in arms. And there's a wonderful and famous story that the park superintendent told at the time when he was seriously considering getting rid of Camp 4. And then a letter came across his desk. And that letter was from Sir Edmund Hillary, who you'll know as one of the first 2 people to climb Mount Everest. And he wrote something very simple, I can paraphrase, but it was something to the effect of, "Dear Sir, there are 3 places in the world of importance to the climbing community, Everest Base Camp, Chamonix, and Camp 4, this little nondescript campsite at the base of El Cap. And now Camp 4 is on the National Register of Historic Places for its contribution to climbing throughout the world. So you'll get to learn a lot more about that here as well.
And the valley, well, a lot of people wonder, where's the other half of Half Dome, and what's the origin of all these very steep cliffs? This area was once rolling foothills, and with plate tectonics, the Pacific plate shoved up underneath the main continental plate, and the mountains started rising, and about 1 million years ago was the start of the Ice Age. And so this whole area was glaciated up pretty much up to the rim, and really carved and sculpted these granite cliffs into what you see today. And the glaciers receded here about 30,000 years ago. Next slide.
And we're just surrounded by it, aren't we? So the previous slide was El Cap. If you turn and look the other way 180 degrees, this is what you see. So you're completely surrounded by all this. And then look in the bottom left of this picture for scale. You see those people down there. You can imagine the grandeur of being among these glaciated mountainsides. And from all of them, there's just water dumping down. So you'll be there in the middle of the summer, which is a wonderful time to be there. The waterfalls are still running at that time of year. And you can get right up to them, and the mist in the middle of the summer when it's hot, the mist feels wonderful. You can get right up there and see all of these waterfalls. This is a picture of Yosemite Falls. This is one of the highest, the tallest waterfalls in all of the world. It is the highest one in North America, 2,000 some odd feet.
425.
What's that?
2,425 feet.
2,425 feet. There you go.
Right.
Jim's counted them all. And then again, just another thing that makes our trip special is that we're staying in the valley. And we have the opportunity to experience these places, not only without the crowds, but in unique ways. This is an image that I made a number of years ago of the same Yosemite Falls from the meadow that stands in front of it. And we did something similar to this on a Nat Hab trip. The moon was out on this night, so you see the moon bow, but even without the moon causing this, you can go out, and we've done this on Nat Hab trips before by walking out to the river and taking these moments to make nice imagery and have special moments for ourselves.
And of course, there are a lot of animals, and both in the valley and the high country. These are just a few of them. The black bear, even though it kind of looks brown, there's the golden mantle ground squirrel on the right, and also the yellow-bellied marmot, which you pretty much only find up in the high country in these rocky areas about 10,000 feet. Next slide.
And I think a lot of our guests are used to, very heavily wildlife, focused trips on a lot of the Nat Hab trips. And so it's worth mentioning, we've started with big rock walls and waterfalls and hiking trails with Yosemite, because that's really what defines Yosemite, and it's different from the other park that begins with a Y, in that the wildlife isn't the main focus. But we do still have the ability to see these animals. Oftentimes it's opportunistic. If we hear that there's a bear somewhere, we can go looking for that particular bear. But generally, we're not focusing in just on wildlife on this trip. In the high country.
I would also mention that this is, and when the trip is occurring, that's the peak wildflower season as well. From the valley, we'll take the Tiger Road up into the high country. This is where Colby and I have spent a lot of time, Tuolumne Meadows, which was also glaciated with the Tuolumne River that flows down through the valley, ultimately to Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, and this is ultimately the water supply for San Francisco. Next slide.
The Tuolumne area is like a completely different park. A lot of people understand Yosemite as the valley. That's just one small slice of the park. And the Tuolumne area, even on normal years, is the quiet part of the park. And this is a subalpine area. It's dominated by large meadows. We have these huge granite domes that have been glaciated that Jim was talking about. And we have Tenaya Lake here in the foreground. So the entire character of the trip has changed by going up in elevation. We're around 8,000 feet now, as opposed to 4,000 feet down in the valley. And this is where we'll see our marmots. We can find osprey, things like that up in here. But these big, expansive meadows are what the Tuolumne area is all about. And the glaciology is really fun. We talk a little bit about glaciers when we're down in the valley. Of course, that the character of Yosemite Valley, the sheer cliffs and the polished rock is all the result of the glaciation times. Up in Tuolumne, we get all sorts of other types of glacial artifacts. And so we have these big things like rocher mountainais and glacial erratics and polish. You can walk across rocks there that are as polished as your granite countertops in your kitchens and bathrooms. So it's really fun to explore the geologic history of this area.
And again, that's Lambert Dome off on the left. It was completely covered by ice during the Ice Age. So next slide. And up the highest point of the Tiger Road is nearly 10,000 feet. And so this is a subalpine area where, again, it's really totally gorgeous. There'll be plenty of opportunities for amazing photography. This happens to be Mount Dana up in the background. This is the second highest peak in the park, a little over 13,000 feet.
And Jim, as you mentioned, the wildflowers are one of the high points, I think, on this trip. Wildflower strewn meadows is what we say, about Tuolumne. And there is a reason that the famous park naturalists focused on botany up in the Tuolumne area. And so you'll be there both in the valley and up in the high country. You'll be there for the peak wildflower seasons, and it makes for some wonderful imagery when you're up there. And then we do something really special, don't we, Jim?
Oh yeah, this is Tiger Pass. Another longtime ranger, unfortunately, has passed away. Ferdinand, for those of you who've been in the park before, he was there for over 30 years and was kind of the caretaker up in the high country, and could always be. He was a really eccentric individual, but he was a great steward, a great representative of our seasonal ranger naturalist and other law enforcement personnel that would stay up the whole summer, which the park up in the high country normally opens up about end of May and then typically closes at the end of October.
So we're going to go up over Tioga Pass, and by going over it, that's going to drop us down into the Eastern Sierra. Right. From the top of Mount Dana that Jim just pointed out to you in a previous slide, you look down and you can see the high desert down there in the Owens Valley. And in particular, we see Mono Lake with its 3 islands. And if it looks a lot like a volcano, it's because it is. This whole area is volcanic on the east side and quite different in character than anything you'll experience inside the park. And Mono Lake is quite a gem, and we're going to go down and explore Mono Lake. And Jim, if I recall, you have a personal connection to Mono Lake as well, don't you?
Right. I during my undergrad year, I was a biology, a zoology student at the UC Davis, and there were a group of graduate students who really were concerned about the water that was being diverted from this area, and also Owens Valley to Los Angeles. And so these formations are called Tupa Towers, and Mono Lake is about 3 times as salty as the ocean, alkaline lake with brine shrimp. But that is a water source for hundreds of thousands of migratory birds that come from the north all the way down to Argentina. There could be as much as 500,000 phalaropes on the lake at any given time. One of the islands, the Black Island, is Negate Island, and it is one of the largest nesting grounds for the California gull. And those gulls come all the way from the Pacific Ocean just to nest and lay their eggs on this island. And so the Mono Lake Committee was started in 1878, really led the vanguard. It was just a bunch of ragtag college students that ultimately succeeded in filing a lawsuit that ultimately went against the LA Department of Water and Power, and ultimately won before the California Supreme Court to maintain a water level in the park to preserve the integrity of the lake itself. It's interesting that the lawsuit that was filed and was under the public trust doctrine, which is a law that dates back to the Roman era and is also codified in the Magna Carta. And it was really the state decided, the Supreme Court decided that it was in the best interest of the public to protect the people's common heritage of the streams, lakes, and marshlands of this area. Next slide.
And thanks to all those protections, today we get to go visit it. I've always had a love for Mono Lake. I've been involved with the Mono Lake Committee myself. In fact, this image and this image have appeared in their calendars for fundraising. And we'll get to experience this in a couple different ways. We're planning on a nice, it's renowned for its sunrises. So we have ourselves positioned in Lee Vining to where it's just about a 15 to 20 minute drive, and we can get over to these Tupa Towers for the famous sunrises. And then after the sun comes up, we're going to have a field breakfast, and then we're going to go and we're going to paddle out on the lake. You'll get to go visit this island that the breeding birds use, and it's quite fascinating how all of these birds that you're used to seeing in estuary areas, shorebirds, gulls, things like that, are using this alkaline high desert lake for their breeding. So we'll get to do that as something a little bit special. From there, then we work our way back into Tuolumne. We have another day or day and a half in Tuolumne before finally departing. So we do a little bit of double backing right at the end because it's worth spending a few days up in Tuolumne. And I think that pretty much sums up our itinerary. Jim, would you be so kind as to say a few closing words for us today?
Oh, sure. We thought we'd leave you with a quote from President Lincoln, who had, again, the great foresight to set aside really this special place. And he said, "Let us hope rather that by the best cultivation of the physical world beneath and around us, and the intellectual and moral world within us, we shall secure an individual, social, and political prosperity and happiness, whose course shall be onward and upward, and which, while the earth endures, shall not pass away." So thank you very much. And Kendall, I believe we're going to open it up to questions.
Yeah, we've got some good questions for you. And I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Jim or Colby today, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, we'll start off with a couple questions about the trip. How much walking or hiking is done each day? And the second question is, do you suggest special hiking boots, or are just good athletic shoes okay?
I can field those questions. A little bit of how much hiking you do is up to you. I think the more hiking you can do, the better. And if you have the ability to go upstairs and trails at an incline for several miles, then you will be able to maximize being able to enjoy Yosemite to its fullest. With that said, we do have two guides. If some people want to do more relaxing, leisurely sort of walks, they can do that. It's always an option to hang out at special places. Like some people just like to be on the river or in a meadow and photograph. You're welcome to do that. But meanwhile, other people, the rest of us, we're gonna go on walks. So you always have the ability to opt out. It's really easy to opt out and do interesting things in Yosemite. But of course, we've come up with this itinerary that we'd love you to participate in. So I think the more active you are, the better. But there's a lot of ways to experience the park. As for footwear, you don't have to have anything special. You don't need to get a brand new pair of stiff hiking boots. I think a nice pair of trail runners, something like that, would be just fine. If you have some hiking boots, it helps with ankle stability. When you're going up and down the stairs, particularly if we're next to the waterfalls and things are a little bit wet, a high top boot can give you a little bit more stability. You can also use trekking poles for that as well.
Right.
Okay, great. So people want to know, when is this trip scheduled and what can you expect as far as weather and what to pack?
Right, the scheduled departures, I believe, are July and August. So this will be summertime. And in the valley, it could be quite warm. If it's a hot day, it could be upwards of 85 or 90, but during the daytime. But then it cools off to where you will need some layers because the temperature changes can be quite dramatic. Once you get up to the high country in Tuolumne Meadows, then Colby, I think the rule of thumb is for every 1,000 feet that you go up, you lose about 3 degrees, right? So it could be cooler up there. But even that said, a lot of times, for most of the day, you could be hiking around with a t-shirt and shorts, and then have other layers to keep you warm if the wind comes up. And then down in Mono Lake, during the summertime, it could also get on the warm side, 80s or 90s. So it's, even though it seems you're in the high Sierra, during this time of the year, it can be on the warm side.
Okay. And someone just wrote in that they're signed up on the last departure after Labor Day, and they just want to know if they'll have missed the waterfalls and wildflowers entirely.
No, not entirely, and it depends on which falls. Some of the falls just have slightly less water in them. Other ones can dry out. It depends a little bit on the year. As for wildflowers, there's always something blooming up there. After Labor Day, you might not be at the very peak of wildflower season, particularly up high, but there are still a lot of little gems around. One of my very favorite flowers on the whole world is the Alpine Junction. It's just a small, diminutive little plant with an outsized flower in it with these beautiful purple stripes, and that comes up starting in September. So there's some really special ones that we can look for at that time of year.
Yeah, and along the streams there invariably will be flowers. And then on the east side, about that time of the year, the rabbit brush starts to turn yellow in and around Mono Lake.
So at this elevation, how do you help people adjust for the need for oxygen?
Yeah, we do have a bit of acclimatization built into the trip. That's one of the reasons that we do the trip in the order that we're doing it in. You get to spend a few nights down low. There's one night in Fresno, you're at 600 feet. There's another few nights in Yosemite Valley, you're at 4,000 feet. We go up high to 8,000 and 10,000 feet into Tuolumne, but we're actually sleeping again down low on the other side in the Eastern Sierra, somewhere around 5,000 feet. So that helps. I think all of that helps ease people into it. Of course, we're always recommending drinking water and that sort of thing. But we're not doing anything that's so strenuous like backpacking up over high passes and things like that, that I don't think most people would feel much more than, you know, just getting tired easily, maybe out of breath easily, but it's easy to recover.
Right. And the big thing with respect to altitude illness is how high you sleep, not necessarily where you're hiking around during the day. But still, it is good to, if you do have some health concerns, to check with your primary care physician because you are walking around and you just want to be on the safe side.
Can you gentlemen speak a little bit about how COVID plays a role into this trip and any adjustments that have been made?
I've been working in the field lately. I can speak to that. So right now, we have a lot of COVID protocols in place, and they're going really, really well. We've been running trips in Yellowstone, which is one of the busiest national parks, and they don't have any restrictions for the number of people that can be in there right now. And we've pulled it off so far without a hitch, leading trips since July. I've been part of that, and we're pretty serious about it. We expect everybody to have masks on. We're constantly sanitizing vehicles. We have special procedures in place now for serving food and dining, all of these things. Essentially, the Nat Hab trips are operating in their own little bubble, and the operators that we're working with have signed on to work with our protocols to help protect our safety as well as their safety, and it's been working very well. We've started to apply that to other places, even around the world right now, but certainly within the American National Parks, that's something that we feel like we have been managing well and can continue to manage well. In Yosemite, there's something else special that's happening is they've instituted a permitting system that will continue through this summer, and they're limiting the number of people that can be in the park. They've limited their staff, they've limited the number of people that can stay overnight, and they're limiting the people that can come in during the day. And so it's made for a really wonderful experience. Yosemite Valley in particular is often known for being very crowded in the summertime, particularly in July and August. And in addition to our itinerary just being different than what most people are doing to start, there's now the permitting system that keeps even more people away. And so we're expecting a lovely and safe experience in the park this summer.
Yeah, I went there last fall when they had this system, and the permits are, if you have an overnight reservation, you can get into the park, and then they allow only a limited number of day use visitors. And so, as Colby was saying, what makes it even more special is that before the day use visitors are allowed in, those people who are staying overnight basically have the place to themselves. So it's really even more special, especially during the middle of the summer.
So there's a lot of curiosity as to whether or not the wildfires in California this year affected Yosemite.
The wildfires we had this past summer, or just wildfires in general? Maybe I can speak.
Yeah, the most recent ones.
The biggest issue in Yosemite this year was smoke, and that's often the case with Yosemite. We do absolutely get fires that come through there. There's been some real big ones. More recently, it's been smoke from fires outside of the park that have affected the park. We can never know how to plan for that. Like what if there's going to be a fire, what weeks it's going to happen, which way the wind will be blowing. These are things that we just can't control. But just like going, anywhere else on a trip, there are environmental concerns. These things can happen anytime, and we're nimble, we're flexible. It's the great thing about small group travel is that if one thing potentially affects our itinerary adversely, then we can pivot. We can do something different that's going to be just as impactful and meaningful for you.
Right. The other thing is that the biggest fire season is in the fall, after these trips occur. That's when you tend to get the biggest fires. But the last few summers, aside from some little spot lightning fires, the big fires were in this area, either south, and then the other big fire was considerably north in the Lake Tahoe region.
Okay, great. Well, it is getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions. I do encourage everyone who's watching, if you have further questions about our trip, visit our website for more details on the itinerary and accommodations, or give us a call at the number you see on the screen, and one of our adventure specialists can help answer any questions you have. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to turn it back over to both of you for closing comments, and we'll start with Jim.
Well, I had the blessing to spend over a span of 14 years here. This place is my second home. I try to go back as much as I can. As Colby will attest, you just get really half a mile off the road, and you can find some really special places and things without anybody around. And so that's a wonderful thing with this trip and two guides, that you have those opportunities to really kind of go off the beaten path and also see the iconic places.
Well, yeah, thanks everybody for being here today. I really appreciate it. This is really a special place, and for those of us that love Nat Hab and conservation travel, adventure travel, exploration, Yosemite has it all. As you've learned, it has the story. It's a thread that connects conservation and the national park system and all the things that we hold dear. And so what better place to go and experience all this for yourself? Come on out with us. It's going to be wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Bye, everybody.